Get super buys at Ward's Super Sale. What kind of color TV can you get right now for just $499? How about a 100% solid-state modular chassis, largest picture tube on the market, speakers on both sides of the screen, easy one-button tuning, all for just $499 right now at Ward's. If you can find a color TV with these features for less money, buy it.
Montgomery Ward, an American retail giant that once was seen all over the place. Their large stores dotted the landscape, but now, no longer. What happened to them? Where did they go? Why did they fail? Well, in their case, while their main corporate rival, Sears, was, at least throughout the 20th century, blessed with mostly decent management, right up until the 1990s or so, Montgomery Ward started struggling in the management department well before Sears did. And it's kind of interesting comparing both of them, because they're nearly identical in terms of business practices and what they sold, and overall management style right up until the 1930s or so. And then, due to multiple mistakes over on Montgomery Ward's side, Sears rocketed ahead of them. It was something Montgomery Ward would never recover from, though they did survive, at least until 2001, in their original form. More on that later. Montgomery Ward was founded in Chicago by Aaron Montgomery Ward. That was just his name, an American entrepreneur who started the company in 1872. It's actually not known exactly where his first office was. Some sources say it was at 825 North Clark Street, but others say it was above a livery stable on Kinsey Street, between Rush and State Streets. But it was in Chicago. Somewhere. We're not 100% sure where, but it was there. And the similarities between him and Sears are pretty staggering, at least in terms of overall business opinions. In Ward's case, he had been born February 17, 1843, to a very large family with a modest income. They were just middle class. They weren't exactly rich, but they weren't super poor either. Ward would move to Chicago in 1865, where he worked as a salesman, but he observed the business practices of the time, and frankly, he thought that there was a better way, not just to make money, but to actually help rural farmers. See, as I explained with Sears, with the way things worked back then, people that lived in rural areas were kind of hosed no matter what they did. If they needed anything, they would usually go to a general store. But for one thing, these general stores were often intermediaries between a larger company and their supplier located in cities and the actual buyer. In this particular business model, not only did the general stores have to upsell everything by quite a bit, but also they usually overcharged by a significant amount. The farmers sometimes simply didn't know what certain things were actually worth and would overpay in many cases. Plus, not every supplier was necessarily created equal. A lot of the stuff may have looked nice, but was actually of very poor quality, meaning they were paying very high prices for what was, in effect, junk. The thing about Ward is that he was a very honest salesman. Yes, he sold things, but he had a moral compass about him, and always thought that it was a better idea, and just the right thing to do, to earn consumer trust by being honest. Not attempting to make a massive profit on whatever was selling, a reasonable profit, of course, but not one that was taking advantage of people. And the whole general store, supplier, farmer thing kind of bothered him quite a lot. He didn't like it, but he thought there was a way around it. Chicago was, by that point, becoming a railroad hub, meaning that there were plenty of goods moving in and out of the city way faster than they ever had before in human history. And more intrinsically, it meant he could set up shop and actually just mail things to people, and they would get them in a reasonable amount of time. They didn't even have to go to the store. And he would sell things via a catalog. Though, unfortunately for Ward, he struggled quite a bit at first, because unlike Sears, who had many good friends that were willing to help him out with his venture, none of Ward's friends actually believed in what he was trying to do. They all thought, frankly, he was out of his mind, that this would never work, so no one was willing to give him money. He found it difficult to actually raise capital to create the company in the first place, and on top of that, the first inventory he was able to gather for his new company was completely obliterated in the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, But just the next year, he did manage to convince a couple of his co-workers to help him with his new startup, which he called Montgomery Ward and Company. He rented a small shipping room and began to publish a general merchandise mail-order catalog. The catalog had a total of 163 different items in its first issue, and for the first few years, it was said that Ward himself wrote the entirety of the catalog, and even when the business became more successful, and he was able to hire, other people to write out these giant catalogs for him, he still made it a point to go over every single line to make certain that it was accurate. He was a very dedicated businessman, but the quality shone through. He wanted to create a company that people would be happy to shop at, to shop with. He wanted to do the same thing that he had done as a salesman working for other people, earn consumer trust, but he was doing it by mail order, which is a bit of a more difficult thing to do since you're not doing it face to face. But if the catalogs were perfect and honest and had set prices, no haggling, then there shouldn't be any issues. And eventually there weren't, though early on he did struggle. Both of his partners dipped on him, but he pushed forward alone. Ward's future brother-in-law, George Robinson Thorne, joined him in the business, and together they turned the whole thing into a huge success. The company began to grow and become quite popular among their rural clientele. So popular that the general store owners actually hated them with such a vile and outrageous passion, to the point that if they got a hold of any of the catalogs, they would on occasion publicly burn them. But I'm not sure what the store owners were thinking, because honestly, if a store owner is so insane that they are willing to burn the catalog of a rival just because everyone's buying from the rival instead of them because they've been price gouging everybody for several years, I don't feel bad for you at all. You're just a little nuts. I'm so sorry. Maybe, if you hadn't been taking advantage of your customers, I don't know, maybe they'd be more willing to shop with you. But indeed, people started liking Montgomery Ward. The general stores really were no threat to him because he was making shopping a lot more convenient for people who dwelled outside of cities. They didn't have to run to the nearest town to get whatever they needed. They could just order it and stay at their farm, and do farming, as farmers are generally known for. Their first major competitor would be the aforementioned Richard Warren Sears, who had, in fact, somewhat copied Ward's catalog style. By the early 1900s, both companies would rise to be two of the dominant players in the catalog market. For the most part, Sears was always slightly ahead of Ward, at least for the first part of the 20th century. In 1900, Ward had total sales of $8.7 million. Sears had $10 million. That's a fair difference, but not a lot when it comes to large companies, and would remain intense rivals for a long time. By 1904, Ward had expanded so much that the company mailed 3 million total catalogs. Each one weighed 4 pounds. 4 pounds of catalog, of just stuff. Buy whatever you want. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. They would open a new complex in 1908, which would be known as the Montgomery Ward and Company Catalog House. It served as their headquarters until 1974, and the building is considered a National Historic Landmark, as well as a Chicago Historic Landmark. Through World War I and into the 1920s, Montgomery Ward began expanding across country to make mailing stuff easier. They wanted things to not take as long to get to people, and since they were basically nationwide, they kinda needed what were, in effect, warehouses, distribution centers all over the place, in a very similar manner to, say, Amazon today. But by the 1920s, things were starting to change. The mail-order business was great and all, but there was a big movement into large department stores. Sears was doing it, and Montgomery Ward would also do it in 1926. They opened their first retail outlet in Plymouth, Indiana. The catalog business still carried forward alongside the brick-and-mortar business, and Montgomery Ward as a company was very aggressive about making sure this happened. By 1928, mind you, only 2 years after they opened their first store, they had opened 244 stores in total. What? Yo, that's nuts. By just the next year, 1929, they were up to 531. a growth margin that borders on lunacy when we're talking about department stores here. Interestingly, in 1930, when the economy was on the downslope, they almost merged with their rival, Sears. The companies did talk about it, but ultimately it did not happen. Sears wound up being able to ride out the Depression mostly unscathed. Ward wasn't quite as fortunate. Remember, they had expanded way too fast. Unreasonably fast. Likely assuming that the great economy that the 1920s generally had would last for a significant amount of time. And then the Great Depression happened and it was like, oh no! Their investors weren't super thrilled about this, and those investors included J.P. Morgan Jr., a man who, like his dad, was made of money. Morgan would wind up hiring a new president for Montgomery Ward to change the company's fortunes in the hard times, named Sewell Avery. Now, Sewell isn't... he's a character. At first, you must give him credit. He did do his job very well. He did what he had to do to keep Montgomery Ward afloat. He laid off staff, as well as cut unprofitable stores, focused on hiring store managers, not catalog managers, and refurbished a lot of the stores. By the end of the 1930s, this all worked. Avery had turned their forces around, though that was at least partially due to a recovering economy. Still, Avery had done solid work. By the end of the 30s, Montgomery Ward was the country's largest retailer, and Avery became their chief executive officer. But, Avery was only good for certain things. He was greatly admired by even his staff, but into World War II, that started changing very, very quickly. Avery was very conservative, both in business and in politics. He didn't like FDR, and he opposed his New Deal, even though the New Deal worked. I mean, that did help a lot when it came to the struggling economy, yeah. And Avery and FDR would butt heads so often into World War II, and you'd think, being involved in the largest global conflict the world has ever seen, Avery might chill? No. He continued to whine and moan, and he hated unions. Just absolutely hated unions. They were the worst thing in the universe to him. Couldn't stand them. And any government involvement in his business infuriated Avery to no end. During World War II, Roosevelt instituted the National War Labor Board, and they were supposed to mediate labor disputes to make sure that the United States economy, as well as their industrial capacity, remained in tip-top form, because again, largest global conflict we'd ever seen. Kind of not the time for y'all to start striking, or cutting wages, or regardless of who's the problem, we can't have any problems right now. Okay? We're getting shot at. Not the time, okay? Well, a union had won representation for 7,000 of Montgomery Ward's employees. That's great, but this of course required them to convince Avery to sign a contract with them. Avery refused. He wouldn't do it, to the point that Roosevelt issued a direct order for him to do it. Avery said no, so Roosevelt ordered him to do it a second time. And he did it then, but in 1944, the union workers went on strike. Avery refused steadfastly to settle with them. He would not negotiate, he would not come to any kind of deal in order to keep the company in operation, which was a problem because in Montgomery Ward's case, they were responsible for delivering certain essential goods that people kind of needed to, live. Also, war? I mean, now is not the time for this! Because of his stubbornness, Roosevelt had no choice but to issue emergency measures to remove him from office and temporarily seize the company to make sure that they kept operating. It wasn't super often that this occurred in America during World War II, but it did happen, and this is one of those cases. In April of 1944, 2 soldiers went into Avery's office, picked him up, and carried him out of his office. Yo! The Attorney General at the time had showed up to try to settle things peacefully. Avery just yelled at him. He said, and I quote, "To hell with the government, you New Dealer!" Oh yeah, you really showed him, Avery. You got him. Top tier. All this nonsense only hurt Montgomery Ward in the long term, but once World War II ended, as promised, the government did return the company to Avery. He was back in charge again, and now he could focus on actually running the company properly. And by that I mean not doing that at all. He completely screwed this up. For one thing, he defied Sears' example in terms of how to treat a workforce. Sears, for a long time, was actually a very good place to work. They offered pension plans, insurance, profit sharing with employees, all sorts of awesome benefits, making people really enjoy working for them. Avery refused to do any of this. No, never! What have those employees ever done for us except work and make sure we function as a company? To be ridiculous! They deserve nothing!
Never! I'd rather that worm come in here right now and eat you all alive!
But on top of that, he refused to spend any money on company expansion during this time. He thought that post-World War II, the economy might go back into another depression, which is what he was personally preparing for. He stowed the money they were making away, rather than reinvesting it immediately so they could maintain liquidity when the economy failed as he predicted. He was wrong. What Avery failed to understand is that World War II was kind of an exception for pretty much, just America, and nobody else. It's true that after wars, the economy in most places does take a bit of a nosedive. There's rebuilding and people don't have homes and don't have any of their money, which may have gotten incinerated in a carpet bombing. I mean, there's a lot of problems to sort out post-war, especially one as brutal as World War II. But this is America. And in America, there were two factors to consider. A, continental United States was basically untouched by the conflict. All of our infrastructure and our money was absolutely fine. But more to the point, we had manufactured and given a lot of weapons to our allies. And by given, I mean Lend-Lease program, which was named that way for a reason. In accordance with the arrangement, our allies kind of owed us a whole bunch of money for those weapons. Listen, we helped you fight a war. Where's the money? We didn't even want to be involved. This is all your fault anyway. As a result, the U.S. economy was absolutely phenomenal into the 1950s. Top tier, we were doing awesome.
To capitalism!
And Sears called it right. They invested in expansion, did the opposite of what Avery did with Montgomery Ward, meaning that while Montgomery Ward stagnated because their boss had chosen to just sit there and do nothing, waiting patiently for a depression that would not actually show up, Sears floored it into the stratosphere, becoming astonishingly successful, way outperforming Montgomery Ward. With Sears enjoying their new dominant position, a lot of people just didn't even go to Montgomery Ward, or even if they wanted to, they really couldn't, because Sears was just more convenient. There were more locations. Sears also had a lot of new items and a lot of exciting new deals. Montgomery Ward, during the 50s, when they absolutely should have been doing that, didn't do that. They still maintain themselves as the third largest department store chain in America, but they used to be the first, and now they were the third. You know, it's kind of a downgrade. And by 1955, investors, specifically Lewis Wolfson, had gotten fed up with Avery. He still sat there at his desk pretending that there was gonna be a depression, guys, I promise, for realsies, and not actually investing all the capital that they had into expansion during the time of insane economic growth in America. The exact period when you should have been doing that exact thing. It was the perfect time to strike, and he just wasn't doing it. So Lewis Wolfson waged a very high-profile proxy fight to obtain control of the board and boot Avery out of the company. It worked. He resigned that same year, and they began actually investing in changes as well as expansion. But it's debatable as to whether or not this was soon enough. It may have been too late. Sears was already well outpacing them, and it was going to be difficult or near impossible to catch up. They did do their best, and even hired a man named Edward Donnell, who was a former manager of Sears' Los Angeles stores. They set about reducing their suppliers from 15,000 down to 7,000, more than half, and they dropped brands from 168 to just 16. That sounds like a pretty steep decline, but the intent here was that Ward's privately owned brands would be given 95% of the volume compared to the 40% they had in 1960. Focusing on their private brands did come with a lot of benefits. Not only was there just a higher profit margin, but there were lower handling costs and higher quality standards since they were their own brands. They could personally make sure that what they were selling was good. Edward Donnell's changes seemed to be working for the moment, and he was named company president in 1966. They even had a friendly merger in 1968 with Container Corporation of America, who manufactured corrugated boxes. And everyone uses boxes. It's a good field to be in. After the merger, a new parent company was formed, known as Marcor, which sounds like a character from Conan the Barbarian, but whatever. Despite all these changes, however, they were still kind of struggling into the 1970s. The delay on doing all this stuff that they should have done well in advance had put them in a really tough position, and it would only get worse. They did, however, in 1973, do something that is relevant. They would purchase a small discount store chain, which was based in Miami, known as Jefferson Stores. These locations would be renamed to Jefferson Ward, and keep that in mind because they'll come up later. Despite their somewhat only treading water situation, they were attractive enough for Mobil, an oil company, and therefore having just so much money, just a disgusting amount of money, where they decided to acquire a controlling share of Marcor in 1974, and then just bought them completely in 1976. So Mobil owned them. But they continued making decisions that on paper really should have worked. For one thing, they were very early to embrace the home computer market. They loved the idea. This was the future, and they weren't wrong. They helped push the CyberVision 2001 in 1978, a very early 8-bit home computer. But into the 80s, there was steep competition, just massive competition for home computers. There were so many companies making them all of a sudden. It wasn't selling that well, so the brand was discontinued by the early 80s. And at about that same time, Mobil noticed something interesting. Because remember, Montgomery Ward had purchased the Jefferson stores, turning them into Jefferson Ward. And Mobil had bought Marcor, which owned Montgomery Ward, so they, by extension, owned Jefferson Ward. The reason this is relevant is that they noticed that Montgomery Ward wasn't doing so hot, but the Jefferson stores were. They were doing okay. So their management decided that the high-quality discount stores, which is what the Jefferson Ward stores were, should be what they focused on. And again, on paper, it might have made sense, but they went about this all wrong. Frankly, they transitioned into it far too quickly, which is something that is possible to do. Within just 18 months, only a year and a half, Mobil's management quintupled the size of the Jefferson Ward side of the operation. And they planned to convert 1/3 of Montgomery Ward's existing stores to the Jefferson Ward model instead. But as I explained, this was all way too fast for this. Despite increasing the size of the operation, they didn't actually increase the size of Jefferson Ward's staff. The managers over there were still the same managers they had before, except now they were responsible for a gargantuan operation that they had no hope of handling on their own. And they were given a bunch of new product lines they'd never seen before, nor knew how to sell properly. And the Jefferson Ward stores, remember, they started down in Florida. They weren't used to the northern markets, which did differ. But now they were responsible for them. Go on, get to it, you'll be fine. They didn't actually hire anybody to handle all this. To put this into perspective for you, well, let's consider, I don't know, soccer. Yeah, there we go, most popular sport in the world. Most of you know what soccer is. Imagine if you had a typical soccer team. You know, responsible for kicking the ball into the other team's goal. Yeah, you know, that makes sense. Okay, all right, same size team. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to take the soccer field and we're going to increase the size of it. And now the field is like 5 miles long. But the team size stays the same. Do you see the problem here? The result of this is that the Jefferson Ward stores, which, as I said, had been doing pretty well, turning some profit, immediately took a nosedive, operating at a significant loss because Mobil had screwed this up so badly. And the heck of it is, they didn't even try to fix their mistake. They just sold off the 18-store Northern Division over to Bradley's and then closed the rest. It was a complete and total failure. That same year, they shut down their catalog business. Though, to be fair, that was probably an intelligent decision, as at that point, it was no longer profitable. But much like with Sears, who would also do that a few years later, they had no replacement for this. The catalogs were also a form of advertising what the retail stores had. Without those, some people just didn't know what Montgomery Ward had anymore, and didn't even bother to go check, because they used to get all of that in the mail, and no longer did. They did, however, start renovating their stores, which were in desperate need of an upgrade. They restructured the layout and tried to make everything more appealing for 1980s-style shoppers, with mixed success. Then, in 1986, the Container Corporation of America was divested by Mobil. That basically meant that Mark Hoare, as a firm, which again held both Container Corporation of America and Montgomery Ward, it didn't even really exist anymore, it didn't need to be there. So Montgomery Ward was now a direct subsidiary of Mobil. Mobil was also looking to get rid of Montgomery Ward, since all it was doing was dragging them down. They had a lot of money, but they weren't willing to just throw it away into the burning heap that was Montgomery Ward, although you guys kind of turned it into that, if we're being honest. But in March of 1988, somewhat good news, the company management themselves undertook a $3.8 billion leveraged buyout, so they wouldn't fall under new management that would also probably screw everything up, to be perfectly honest. And that meant Montgomery Ward was once again a privately held company. Great! It didn't matter though, unfortunately. See, it was into the 90s, and they had a different problem in the 90s. They'd already lost a lot of ground to Sears, and that was going to be difficult to make up, and they would never do that. But they also had new competition. Big box. Walmart and Target were here, and even Sears was starting to struggle. Montgomery Ward stood no chance. There was nothing they could do about this, and they would continue to decline all the way until 1997, when they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protections. That wasn't the end of them, though. They did emerge from that. In August of 1999, they were able to restructure themselves, though as a wholly owned subsidiary of GE Capital, their largest shareholder at that point. In an effort to stay competitive, they did exactly two things. They closed a whole bunch of different locations that were unprofitable, which was a good idea, and they abandoned some of their specialty store strategies. For a while, Montgomery Ward's had used things like Electric Avenue, which was basically a store within a store type deal, where, honestly, it was just the electronics section, but they called it Electric Avenue, presumably because someone was a big fan of Eddie Grant. They stopped doing that, and they rebranded. Yes, because that's the... Why do they always do this? I swear, in every one of these failed businesses, we always go through some kind of weird rebranding. Well, now they're no longer Montgomery Ward. You know what they are? They're simply... Wards. Yeah. I mean, at least it didn't go with the Ward, which probably would have caused me to put my face through the wall in frustration. But what was now known as Wards did not actually help. And GE Capital kind of stabbed them in the back. They had promised to invest a significant amount of money to support their further restructuring plans, because they wanted to really renovate the new Wards model, making it, frankly, a lot more big boxy, because they knew that's what people wanted. But GE Capital didn't do what they said they were going to do. They simply didn't have the money for it. And after an absolutely disgusting holiday season in the year 2000, Wards didn't have a choice. On December 28th of the year 2000, they announced they would cease operations and close their remaining 250 locations, and 37,000 people would lose their jobs. But, in a weird way, they're not really gone. The original company is long dead, but the name still carries forward. Because of the recognizability of Montgomery Ward, even if you haven't shopped there, some of you may have even heard of it before, the brand was worth something. When they liquidated, they sold off the rights to the name too, and where the name ended up in a weird way was kind of going back to the roots of the company. In 2004, a catalog marketer, known as Direct Marketing Services Incorporated, or DMSI, purchased most of the intellectual property assets. They therefore had the rights to both the Montgomery Ward name as well as the Wards name. They would apply the brand to a new online and catalog-based retailing operation with no physical stores at all. They sold many of the same kinds of products as the original company. This initial run had some mixed success, while the idea of going full online, which the original Montgomery Wards never even had a chance to even think about doing that, was a great idea in the early 2000s, they did have to contend with the big boys in that field, like Amazon. In July of 2008, DMSI announced that they were being auctioned off, but they would be purchased by another catalog retailer known as Swiss Colony. That company, which is now known as Colony Brands, opted to keep the Montgomery Ward brand alive and relaunched the website on September 10th, 2008. New catalogs were even mailed out in February of 2009, and today it's still around. No, seriously, you could go to wards.com and buy stuff. It's been fairly successful, all things considered, as a solely online retailer, and like I said, it kind of means the whole company went back to their roots. I mean, they're under new ownership now, and it's just the name, but it's the same basic principle as the old school catalogs. In the modern day, an online-only retailer is effectively the equivalent of a catalog-only retailer in the late 1800s, because there was no internet, so the only way to do that would be catalogs. But it's still long-distance retail. You're still placing an order from a distance away and waiting for the item to be shipped to you. There's just a different go-between method in the modern day. But regardless, it is nice to see that the name isn't dead, because a lot of people did really like Montgomery Ward. They had some pretty good brands, all things considered, and particularly in their early days, they did a lot of things right. They have a foundation based on principles and honesty, fair retail, and fair sales with fair prices. But inevitably, they were taken over by managers who didn't understand a word of what I just said, nor did they care, and proceeded to abuse their workforce and dig their heels in with what they honestly thought was right, even when the entire world around them was screaming at them, "No, no, you fool! Look outside! Everyone owns cars! Build more stores, you moron!" And the thing about bad management, especially in the corporate world, is it only takes a few years of that to completely tank a once mighty empire. Such was the case of Montgomery Ward. To be truthful, I don't think they would have survived in their original format, because, I mean, look at Sears. We already talked about that. That didn't turn out well either, but for somewhat different reasons. Montgomery Ward never got far enough to be in Sears' current position, and it was based on mistakes made decades earlier. They had an uphill battle from the start, and as the market shifted into big box, they were woefully unprepared to deal with any of it, because they couldn't even deal with the competition before. It's a shame, but hey, online store. It still exists. You can buy stuff. I'm saying that as an option. They're not sponsoring me or anything. I'm not saying you can do that. It's just a fact. And with that, a special thank you goes to all my underwater train finders. Some Dude 267, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Road Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Josh Johnson, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Dolinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, Mr. Terevel, Hayden DeGrow, Bad Train Puns Are Best, Kurt Forkham, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Duralshi, A Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shimasu, Metal for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Wehofer, Zintek M, Boss K, Orange Glass, Andy, The Conceptualist, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, John Videolaw, AET Museum, Extra Special J, Jonathan Coco, Kieran Tibbetts, DFL Church, Murder Jones Doll, Bob Kondirk, Your Mom Liked It, Jared Brussel, Caden Alvey, Levi Anderson, Darrell Williams, Liam Wright, DE Ultra, Mr. Sleepy, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.